An airline officer pointed her finger like a weapon at the woman in the wheelchair. The small dog pressed against Linda Allen's chest wasn't barking, wasn't moving. He was working. But Susanna Gilman didn't see a service animal. She saw something she could control. Say the dog isn't real. Susanna's voice cut through the crowded terminal. Or you're not flying. Linda thought it was just another humiliating checkpoint until Spark's body went rigid against her ribs. He knew something she didn't. And in 60 seconds, everyone in that terminal would know it too. The fluorescent lights in this part of the airport didn't just illuminate. They were exposed. They washed out color and cast harsh shadows across the polished floors, turning every exhausted traveler into a ghost of themselves. Linda Allen felt the weight of those lights before she felt the stares. She sat motionless in her wheelchair near Gate 17, hands wrapped protectively around the small tan and white dog resting against her sternum. She was a woman in her early 30s, though the wheelchair often made strangers assume she was older, more fragile than she was. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, revealing a face marked not by weakness but by the quiet exhaustion of someone who had learned to fight battles most people never see. Her eyes, a soft hazel that caught the light when she wasn't crying, carried a wariness that hadn't been there 5 years ago, before the neurological injury, before the episodes, before she'd had to prove her body's betrayals to strangers. She wore a denim jacket over a gray cotton shirt, comfortable travel clothes chosen for function, not fashion. Around her lap sat a carry-on bag, a boarding pass creased from anxious handling, and a red service vest draped over her knees. Proof she tried to prepare for this. Pressed against her chest was Spark. Spark was a 3-year-old mixed breed, small and unassuming, with a coat of tan, cream, and white that made him look more like a beloved pet than a medical necessity. But his dark, intelligent eyes told a different story. They were locked on Linda, tracking her breathing, her posture, the microtremors in her fingers. He had been with her for 18 months, trained by a nonprofit that specialized in neurological alert dogs, and their bond was forged not in joy, but in survival. Linda had collapsed 3 times before Spark. She hadn't collapsed since. Linda caught the metallic scent of recycled air mixed with cleaning solution and the faint sweetness of Cinnabon from 2 gates over. She hated airports. The noise, the chaos, the unpredictability, all of it triggered the stress responses her body could no longer regulate on its own. But she'd done this before. She'd flown alone before. She knew the drill. Boarding pass and ID ready, she whispered to herself, a mantra. Spark shifted slightly, his paw pressing gently against her forearm. A reminder. I'm here. Then Susanna Gilman appeared. She emerged from the crowd with the rigid posture of someone who wore authority like armor. Susanna was a woman in her mid-40s, impeccably put together in a crisp Navy airline uniform with a silver name badge that caught the light. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, not a strand out of place. Her expression was neutral, professional, unreadable until you looked at her eyes. They were cold, assessing, already convinced. She was the kind of person who believed rules existed to protect order, not people. Susanna's gaze landed on Spark, and something hardened. Linda felt it before she saw it, that familiar sinking sensation when someone in power decides you're the problem. Susanna's black work shoes clicked across the tile with unsettling purpose. She stopped directly in front of Linda's wheelchair, close enough that Linda had to tilt her head back to meet her eyes. The power imbalance was immediate, deliberate. "Ma'am," Susanna said, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "We need to talk about that dog. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story." Linda's throat tightened. She'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times in her head during the drive to the airport, during check-in, during the slow roll through security. She knew her rights. She'd memorized the relevant sections of the Air Carrier Access Act. She'd even printed documentation, though legally, she didn't have to show it. He's a service dog, Linda said, her voice quieter than she wanted it to be. She cleared her throat and tried again, steadier this time. His name is Spark. He's trained for my disability. Susanna's expression didn't change. She didn't pull out a tablet to review policy. She didn't ask for documentation. She didn't even look at the red service vest still draped across Linda's lap, the one that clearly read service dog. Do not distract in bold white letters. Instead, Susanna tilted her head slightly, her gaze moving from Spark's alert face to his compact frame, then back to Linda. He doesn't look like a service dog. The words landed like a verdict. Linda blinked.
I'm sorry.
Service dogs are usually larger, Susanna continued, her tone matter-of-fact, as though she were simply stating an obvious truth. German Shepherds, Labradors, Golden Retrievers. This, she gestured vaguely at Spark, this is a small dog, and he's sitting on you. He's trained to, and he's too calm. Susanna's voice sharpened just slightly. Real service dogs are professional. They don't cuddle. Linda felt her chest constrict. Spark shifted immediately, his body pressing more deliberately against her sternum. It wasn't cuddling. It was grounding. He was reading the acceleration of her heartbeat, the subtle hitch in her breathing. Early warning signs Linda herself didn't always catch in time. He is professional, Linda said, fighting to keep her voice level. He's doing his job right now. Susanna's lips pressed into a thin line. Ma'am, I've worked for this airline for 12 years. I've seen plenty of service dogs. And I've seen plenty of people trying to pass off pets as service animals to avoid paying fees. The accusation hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. Linda's fingers tightened in Spark's fur. I have a neurological condition. It's called. I'm sure you do, Susanna interrupted smoothly. But that doesn't mean he is trained to help with it. He is. Linda's voice cracked. She hated how small she sounded. How defensive. I have episodes. Sudden shutdowns. My autonomic nervous system, it doesn't regulate properly. Stress, fatigue, overstimulation, any of it can trigger an episode. I lose motor control. I get disoriented. Sometimes I can't speak. Sometimes I collapse. She paused, trying to steady her breathing. Spark's weight shifted fractionally, adjusting his pressure. Spark is trained to detect the early signs before I even feel them. He monitors my breathing, my heart rate, my body language. When an episode starts, he applies deep pressure therapy across my chest and lap. The weight helps regulate my nervous system, keeps me grounded, keeps me conscious. Linda's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Without him, I'd be on the floor right now. Susanna looked down at Spark again, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Linda thought maybe she'd gotten through. Then Susanna straightened. That's a lovely story, but it doesn't change what I see. A small dog sitting in your lap like a pet. He's not. And frankly, ma'am, if your condition is that severe, perhaps you shouldn't be traveling alone. The words cut deeper than Linda expected. She felt her hands begin to tremble, not from emotion, but from the physiological response her body no longer controlled. The tremor started in her fingers and radiated up her wrists. Spark felt it instantly. His ears flicked back. His paw pressed firmly against her forearm. A deliberate signal. I'm here. Stay with me. But Linda's vision was already beginning to blur at the edges. I'm allowed to travel alone, she managed, her voice tight. The ADA. I'm not questioning your rights, Susanna said, though her tone suggested otherwise. I'm questioning whether that dog is legitimate. By now, passengers waiting nearby had begun to notice. A man in a business suit glanced up from his laptop. A woman with 2 young children paused mid-sentence, her attention caught by the tension in Susanna's voice. A teenager leaning against a pillar pulled out his phone, angling it subtly toward the scene. Linda felt the stares like physical weight. Her breathing hitched again. Spark pressed harder. "Please," Linda said, hating the desperation creeping into her voice. "I just need to board my flight. I'm not causing any problems. He's not bothering anyone." Susanna crossed her arms. "You're causing a delay. I'm not. And you're making other passengers uncomfortable." Linda glanced around. The man with the laptop had looked away. The woman with the children was whispering to them, casting sideways glances. The teenager's phone was definitely recording now. No one was uncomfortable because of Spark. They were uncomfortable because of this. Susanna leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so only Linda could hear. Her tone shifted, less official now, almost conspiratorial. "Look, I'm trying to help you. If you just admit that he's not a real service dog, we can move past this. I'll let you take him in a carrier. You'll still make your flight. No one has to file a report." Linda's breath caught. "Are you asking me to lie? I'm giving you an option." Susanna's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "If he's not real, you can still fly. Just say it." Spark's entire body went still against Linda's chest. Not relaxed, still. The kind of stillness that came before action. Linda looked down at him, at his dark eyes fixed on her face, at the service vest bunched between them, at the small red patch on his harness that read medical alert dog. She thought about the 3 times she'd collapsed before Spark. Once in a grocery store, once at home alone, once in a parking lot where a stranger had called 911 because they thought she was dying. She thought about the 18 months of training, the certification, the thousands of dollars in vet bills and equipment. The bond was forged in necessity. She thought about what would happen if she got on that plane without him and had an episode at 30,000 feet. "No," Linda whispered. Susanna straightened. "Excuse me?" Linda lifted her chin. Meeting Susanna's gaze, even as tears began to blur her vision. "I won't lie about him. He's real. He's trained. And he's keeping me safe right now." Susanna's expression hardened. The warmth, the false offer of mercy, evaporated completely. "Then," she said clearly, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear, "you're not boarding this flight." The gate area had gone quiet in that particular way crowds do when they sense conflict. Not silent, but hushed, with conversations dropped to whispers and eyes darting sideways to watch without appearing to watch. Linda felt every gaze like a pinprick against her skin. "Ma'am, I need you to understand the situation you're putting us in." Susanna's voice carried now, projecting across the waiting area with the practiced authority of someone who knew exactly how public shame worked. "This airline takes service animal fraud very seriously. We have policies in place to protect passengers who genuinely need assistance." The implication was surgical. "You are not one of those passengers." Linda's mouth went dry. "I'm not committing fraud." "Then you'll have documentation to prove it." Susanna extended her hand, palm up, as though the matter were simple. "Reasonable. Training certificates. Veterinary records. A letter from your doctor explaining your disability and why you require this specific animal." Linda's hands trembled harder now. "I don't have to show you that. The law doesn't require." "The law," Susanna interrupted smoothly, "allows us to ask 2 questions. Is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to perform?" She paused, her expression shifting into something that might have been sympathy if it hadn't been so condescending. "You've answered the first, but your answer to the second was vague. I told you. You told me a story about your condition. You didn't tell me what tasks he performs." Linda felt her chest tightening, the familiar constriction that always preceded an episode. Spark's ears lifted immediately, swiveling toward her face. His body, which had been applying steady pressure, tensed with new alertness. "He detects changes in my breathing and heart rate," Linda said, forcing the words out. "He applies deep pressure therapy. He alerts before episodes. He prevents me from collapsing." Susanna's eyebrows lifted slightly. So he sits on you. He provides medical intervention. It looks like cuddling. Behind Susanna, the teenager with the phone had been joined by two friends. All three were recording now, their expressions ranging from curious to entertained. The woman with the children had pulled them closer, as though Linda's disability might be contagious. The businessman had his arms crossed, watching with the detached judgment of someone who'd already decided who was right. Linda felt the weight of their assumptions crushing down on her. Liar, faker, entitled, taking advantage. Please, she whispered. I just want to go home. Susanna sighed. A long, theatrical exhale that suggested infinite patience tested beyond its limits. And I want to help you, but you're making this very difficult. She turned slightly, addressing the growing crowd with the air of someone seeking witnesses to her reasonableness. I've been more than accommodating. I've listened to her explanation. I've given her every opportunity to provide documentation. But when someone refuses to cooperate with basic verification procedures, what am I supposed to think? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Linda couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. She could read it in their faces, the way some nodded, the way others looked at her with thinly veiled disgust. I'm not refusing, Linda said, her voice breaking. I've answered your questions. I've told you what he does. Eve. You've told me what you want me to believe. Susanna's voice dropped back to a normal volume, but somehow that made it worse. More intimate, more damning. But I've been doing this job long enough to recognize when someone is trying to game the system. The accusation landed like a slap. Linda felt her vision beginning to tunnel at the edges. Her fingers had gone numb. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, insufficient. Spark registered every change. His paw pressed insistently against her forearm, then moved to her thigh, an escalating signal. Warning, warning, warning. I'm not. Linda couldn't finish the sentence. The words tangled in her throat. You know what I think? Susanna continued, her tone almost gentle now, the way a predator might sound right before it closes its jaws. I think you love your dog. I think you don't want to pay the pet fee or deal with the carrier requirement. I think you found some information online about service animals and decided it was easier to claim he was trained than to follow the rules everyone else follows. That's not. I think you're probably a nice person who made a selfish choice. Tears spilled over Linda's cheeks now, hot and humiliating. She tried to wipe them away, but her hands were shaking too badly. Spark shifted his entire body weight, repositioning himself more deliberately across her lap. His head pressed against her chest, just below her collarbone. To anyone watching, it might have looked like he was seeking comfort. He was providing it, but no one was looking closely enough to see the difference. Look at her, someone muttered from the crowd. Linda couldn't tell who. Crying because she got caught. Another voice, just put the dog in a carrier. What's the big deal? Probably one of those emotional support animal people. Linda wanted to disappear, wanted to sink through the floor, through the earth, through everything. She couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think, couldn't defend herself against the collective weight of their judgment. Susanna watched her for a long moment, then glanced around at the crowd, seeming to measure something. When she looked back at Linda, there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, as though she'd proven exactly what she'd set out to prove. Then she did something worse than standing over her. She knelt. Susanna lowered herself slowly, deliberately, until she was at eye level with Linda. The gesture looked compassionate to anyone watching. It looked like an authority figure showing kindness to someone in distress. But when Susanna spoke, her voice was low enough that only Linda could hear, and there was nothing kind in it. I'm going to give you one more chance, she said softly, because I don't actually want to ruin your day. I don't want you to miss your flight. I don't want to file an official report that could flag you for future travel. Linda's breathing was ragged now. Spark's entire body had gone rigid with tension. "All you have to do," Susanna continued, her eyes locked on Linda's, "is tell the truth. Say he's fake. Admit he's just a pet you didn't want to put in cargo. Do that and I'll let you take him in a carrier in the cabin. You'll board in 10 minutes. This all goes away." She paused, letting the offer hang between them. "Say he's fake," Susanna whispered, "or you don't board." The terminal tilted. Not dramatically, not the way it did in movies when someone fainted. It was subtler than that. The fluorescent lights stretched and warped at the edges of Linda's vision, and the polished floor seemed to ripple like water. Sound became muffled, as though someone had wrapped her head in cotton. Her hands were shaking now, not the slight tremor from before, but a visible, uncontrollable shake that made her boarding pass flutter in her grip like a trapped bird. No, not here, not now. But her body didn't take requests anymore. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, quick inhales that didn't seem to bring any oxygen with them. Her chest felt tight, constricted, as though invisible hands were squeezing her ribs. The tremor spread from her hands up her arms, and she felt the first wave of disorientation crash over her, that terrifying sensation of being untethered from her own body. She tried to speak, to tell Susanna what was happening, but her tongue felt thick and clumsy in her mouth. Spark moved before Linda even registered the full extent of what was happening. He shifted his weight in her lap with deliberate precision, rising slightly on his hind legs. In one fluid motion, he climbed higher onto her chest, positioning his body lengthwise across her torso. His front paws pressed into her shoulders. His weight settled firmly across her sternum and diaphragm. Not crushing, but present. Solid. Grounding. 23 pounds of trained pressure, applied exactly where her nervous system needed it most. Linda's next breath came easier. Not fully, not yet, but the tight band around her chest loosened fractionally. Spark's body rose and fell with her breathing, his own respiration slow and measured, a rhythm her body instinctively tried to match. In. His warmth seeped through her jacket, through her shirt, directly against her skin. His heartbeat was steady, calm, a counterpoint to her racing pulse. He pressed his muzzle gently against her collarbone, his dark eyes locked on her face, monitoring every micro-expression. Linda's vision was still blurred, her hands still shaking, but she could feel the edges of the episode beginning to stabilize. Not fade, not yet, but hold. Spark was buying her time, keeping her conscious, preventing the full collapse. A woman nearby gasped softly. "Oh, look how sweet. He's cuddling with her?" Someone else murmured, their voice carrying a note of sympathy mixed with skepticism. "Cute dog," the teenager with the phone said, still recording. Susanna's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "See," she gestured toward Linda and Spark, her tone dripping with vindication. "He's just cuddling. That's not service dog behavior. That's a pet comforting its owner." Linda wanted to scream, wanted to explain, but her vocal cords wouldn't cooperate. All she could manage was a strangled sound that barely qualified as speech. "Ma'am," Susanna continued, her voice rising slightly for the benefit of their audience, "I think we both know what's really happening here. You brought a pet. You're calling it a service dog. And now you're having some kind of emotional response because you've been caught. Emotional response. As if her autonomic nervous system shutting down was the same as being upset." Spark pressed harder. His paw slid from her shoulder to her chest, applying rhythmic pressure in time with her breathing. In. His body didn't waver. He didn't look away from her face. Every ounce of his attention was focused on keeping Linda anchored to consciousness. This wasn't affection. This was medical intervention. Linda's breathing began to even out. Still shallow, still labored, but no longer spiraling. The tremor in her hands started to lessen. The warping at the edges of her vision began to recede, bringing the terminal back into sharper focus. She could see Susanna more clearly now, could see the smug certainty in her expression, could see the passengers forming a loose semicircle around them, phones out, judgment written across their faces. But she could also see something else. A few people looked uncomfortable now. Not with Spark, with Susanna. An older man with gray hair and kind eyes frowned slightly. A woman in scrubs, maybe a nurse, maybe a doctor, tilted her head, studying Spark's positioning with professional interest. "That's not cuddling," the woman in scrubs said quietly, almost to herself. Susanna didn't hear her, or chose not to. "If you can't control yourself in a public space," Susanna said, her voice taking on a patronizing edge, "then maybe you shouldn't be traveling. And you certainly shouldn't be bringing an untrained animal into an airport and disrupting." Spark's body went rigid. Linda felt it instantly, the shift from steady pressure to alert tension. His ears snapped forward. His head lifted slightly from her collarbone. His eyes, which had been fixed on her face, darted toward the periphery of her vision, tracking something she couldn't see yet, but he could sense. No. Her heart rate was spiking again. The brief stabilization Spark had created was fracturing. The episode wasn't over, it was escalating. Her body was tipping past the point where pressure therapy alone could hold it back. Spark knew. He adjusted his position fractionally, redistributing his weight, applying more pressure across her diaphragm. His breathing slowed even further, almost exaggerated, trying to coax hers to follow. But Linda could feel herself slipping. The disorientation was returning, stronger this time. Her fingers went slack around the boarding pass, and it drifted to the floor. The edges of her vision darkened. Not blurred now, but genuinely darkening, like someone was slowly turning down the lights. Her head felt too heavy. Her neck couldn't support it. "I'm going to collapse." Spark pressed his muzzle firmly against her jaw, a physical tether, and then he barked. Not a playful yip, not an uncertain whine. A single, sharp, commanding bark that cut through the ambient noise of the terminal like a gunshot. The sound was so sudden, so precise, that everyone within 20 feet froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The teenager's phone dipped. Susanna's mouth hung open, her next accusation dying on her lips. Even the ambient noise of the airport, the distant announcements, the rumble of luggage wheels, the hum of hundreds of simultaneous conversations, seemed to momentarily hush. Spark didn't bark again. He didn't need to. His body remained locked in position across Linda's chest, his eyes fixed on her face with absolute focus. But that single bark had done what his presence alone could not. It had made everyone stop. It had made them see. And in the sudden, shocked silence that followed, Linda's body finally betrayed her completely. Her vision went black. The terminal had gone silent. Not the natural quiet of a lull between announcements, but the heavy, breathless silence of people witnessing something they didn't fully understand but couldn't look away from. Spark remained motionless across Linda's lap and torso, his body a solid, grounding weight. His breathing was slow, deliberate, each inhale and exhale measured with the precision of a metronome. His chest rose and fell against Linda's ribs, and without conscious thought, her own breathing began to mirror his. In, hold. In, hold. The dizziness that had threatened to pull her under began to recede. Not quickly, neurological episodes didn't work that way, but gradually, in increments, the static at the edges of her vision started to clear. The numbness in her fingers eased as circulation returned. The tremor in her hands slowed, then stilled. Spark didn't move. He didn't lick her face or whine or show any of the behaviors people associated with a distressed pet. He simply held, his weight distributed perfectly across her body, applying consistent pressure to the points that mattered most. His head rested near her collarbone, his dark eyes locked on her face, tracking every micro-expression, every sign of improvement or decline. A woman standing 3 feet away whispered to her companion, Oh my God. He's actually... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The businessman who'd been filming lowered his phone slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to shame. The mother who'd pulled her children back earlier now stood frozen, one hand over her mouth. The teenager who'd made the cruel remark about emotional support stared at the floor, his face flushed. Linda's breathing deepened. The fog in her mind began to lift, piece by piece, like curtains being drawn back from a window. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, no longer the erratic, panicked rhythm that had signaled the onset of the episode. Spark felt it too. His ears flicked forward slightly, a microscopic shift that only someone who knew him would recognize as significant. She was stabilizing. Susanna stood exactly where she'd been when Spark had barked. Frozen mid-turn, her radio still clutched in one hand. Her face had gone pale, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like uncertainty. She glanced at the crowd, then back at Linda, then down at Spark. For the first time since this confrontation began, Susanna said nothing. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Time felt elastic, unreliable. Linda focused on the rhythm Spark had given her. In hold out and slowly, impossibly, she felt herself return. Her fingers, which had gone slack and useless, regained sensation. She flexed them experimentally, feeling the texture of Spark's fur beneath her palms. Her vision sharpened. The individual faces in the crowd came into focus. Some concerned, some embarrassed, some still recording. She could hear the hum of the HVAC system again, the distant beep of a departing shuttle, the rustle of someone shifting their luggage. She was still here, still conscious, still whole. Spark sensed the change. His body remained pressed against hers, but the intensity of his focus softened fractionally. His breathing stayed slow, guiding hers, but his tail, pressed against the side of the wheelchair, gave a single, almost imperceptible wag. "You're okay. I've got you." Linda exhaled, long and shaky. Her hands trembled now not from neurological failure but from sheer emotional exhaustion. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, warm and unchecked, but she didn't bother wiping them away. She looked down at Spark, at his calm, watchful face, at the red service vest still visible beneath his body, at the way he held himself with absolute purpose and precision. This wasn't a pet seeking comfort. This wasn't a dog cuddling his owner. This was a trained medical alert animal performing a life-saving intervention in real time, in front of dozens of witnesses who had been told, who had believed he was fake. Linda lifted her gaze slowly, scanning the crowd. No one was laughing now. No one was rolling their eyes or muttering about scams. A few people were crying. One man nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement she didn't have the energy to return. Then her eyes found Susanna. The airline officer stood rigid, her expression carefully neutral, but her hands betrayed her. They were clenched at her sides, knuckles white. The radio hung uselessly from her belt. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. For the first time, Susanna Gilman looked unsure. Linda's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse and raw, barely above a whisper. But in the silence of the terminal, every word carried. "He just saved me." She paused, her breath hitching. "He does that every time." The supervisor arrived with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to cleaning up other people's mistakes. His name was Marcus Chen, according to the badge clipped to his charcoal suit. He was a man in his 50s with silver-threaded black hair and the kind of measured expression that came from years of navigating corporate liability. He moved through the dispersing crowd with 2 airport security officers flanking him, his eyes taking in the scene with practiced assessment. Linda in her wheelchair, tear-streaked and trembling. Spark still pressed against her, vigilant. Susanna standing rigid, her earlier confidence beginning to fracture at the edges. "Ms. Gilman," Marcus said, his voice professionally neutral. "My office. Now." I was handling a service animal dispute, Susanna said quickly. Standard protocol. We'll discuss protocol in my office. He turned to Linda, and his expression softened fractionally. Ma'am, I'm Marcus Chen, Terminal Operations Supervisor. Are you all right? Do you need medical attention? Linda shook her head, not trusting her voice yet. Spark remained motionless against her chest, his work not yet finished. Can you tell me what happened here? Before Linda could respond, one of the passengers stepped forward, a middle-aged woman in a green cardigan who'd been sitting 3 rows back. I can tell you what happened. That officer, she pointed at Susanna, accused this woman of faking her service dog. She threatened to remove her from the flight. She never asked for documentation, never asked what the dog was trained to do. Just decided he wasn't real because he's small. That's not, Susanna started. I have it on video, the teenager with the phone interjected, holding up his device. All of it, including the part where you told her to lie and say the dog was fake so she could still fly. Marcus's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Forward that to airport security, please. He nodded to one of the officers, who immediately moved to collect the teenager's contact information. Another voice rose from the crowd, an older man in a veteran's cap. I watched the whole thing. That dog saved her. Had some kind of medical episode right here, and the dog knew before any of us did. Wasn't fake. I wasn't cuddling. That was real. The dog was exhibiting pet behavior, Susanna insisted, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. Sitting on her lap, being overly affectionate. He was performing deep pressure therapy, Marcus interrupted, pulling out a tablet. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen. I'm looking at the Air Carrier Access Act requirements right now. At no point does it specify size, breed, or behavior standards beyond the animal being trained to perform tasks related to a disability. He looked up. Did you ask Ms.
Allen, Linda supplied quietly. Linda Allen.
Did you ask Ms. Allen what tasks her service animal performs? Silence. Did you request any documentation, even though you're not required to deny boarding based on lack of documentation alone? More silence. Did you follow the prescribed protocol for service animal disputes, which requires supervisor consultation before any boarding denial? Susanna's face had gone pale. I was using my judgment. Your judgment, Marcus said, his tone hardening, nearly resulted in this airline denying passage to a disabled passenger with a legitimate service animal, in full view of witnesses and cameras, after you explicitly asked her to lie about her disability accommodation. He gestured to the security officer on his left. Pull the security footage from the last 30 minutes. Gate 17, all angles. The officer nodded and spoke quietly into his radio. Marcus turned back to Linda. Ms. Allen, I apologize on behalf of this airline. This should never have happened. We will be conducting a full investigation, and I can assure you there will be consequences. Linda found her voice at last. It came out stronger than she expected, steadied by Spark's weight and the truth that no one could deny anymore. She tried to erase me, Linda said, looking directly at Susanna. Not just my dog. Me. My disability. My reality. She decided I was lying before I said a word. She weaponized policy without following it. She humiliated me in public and then offered me a deal. Lie about the one thing keeping me safe or be stranded. Her hands had stopped shaking. Spark's pressure had done its work. She didn't see a person who needed accommodation. She saw an inconvenience she could eliminate. Susanna opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time since this began, she looked small, uncertain, stripped of the authority she'd wielded like a weapon. Marcus's expression remained professionally neutral, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Ms. Gilman, you're removed from gate duty effective immediately. You'll surrender your credentials to security and report to HR within the hour. He nodded to the second officer. Please escort Ms. Gilman from the gate area. This is... Susanna's voice cracked. I was doing my job. No, Marcus said quietly. You weren't. The security officer stepped forward, and Susanna had no choice but to follow. She walked through the same crowd that had watched Linda's humiliation, but now the stares had shifted. Now the judgment belonged to her. As Susanna disappeared through the terminal, Linda exhaled slowly. Spark's tail thumped once against her lap. The ghost of a smile touched Linda's lips. Good boy, she whispered. The terminal had gone quiet in the way spaces do after violence. Not the physical kind, but the kind that leaves everyone feeling complicit. Linda sat in her wheelchair near gate 17, exactly where she'd been 40 minutes ago, but everything had changed. Spark rested against her lap now, calm and watchful, his work done. Her breathing had steadied. Her hands no longer shook. But her face was still wet with tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. Around her, passengers who had watched, who had filmed, whispered, judged, now couldn't seem to look at her directly. The man in the business suit who'd glanced up from his laptop stood near the window now. Phone pressed to his ear, but his eyes kept drifting back to Linda. When their gazes accidentally met, he flinched and turned away. The woman with the two young children approached slowly, hesitantly, as though crossing a minefield. She stopped a few feet from Linda's wheelchair, wringing her hands. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have said something. I should have. Her voice broke. I'm so sorry. Linda nodded, unable to speak yet. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She touched her children's shoulders and guided them away, but not before the older child. A girl, maybe 7, whispered, Is the doggy okay? He's okay, Linda managed, her voice hoarse. He's a good dog. The teenager who'd been filming stood frozen near his pillar, phone still in his hand, staring at the screen. His face had gone pale. Whatever he'd captured, whatever he'd thought this was when he started recording, it wasn't that anymore. He walked over, slowly, like someone approaching a shrine. I posted it, he said quietly. The video. It's already going everywhere. People need to see this. They need to know what happened to you. Linda looked at him, really looked. He couldn't have been more than 17. His hands were shaking. I'm sorry I didn't help, he added. I didn't know what to do. It's okay, Linda whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was. He nodded, blinking hard, and walked away. An elderly man with a cane, someone Linda hadn't even noticed watching, paused beside her wheelchair. He didn't say anything. He just placed his hand briefly on her shoulder, squeezed once, and continued toward his gate. The gesture was small, but it cracked something open inside her chest. More people left. Some couldn't handle the weight of what they'd witnessed. Some couldn't reconcile the person they judged with the person they now saw. They gathered their bags, avoided eye contact, and disappeared into the flow of travelers, carrying their shame with them. But Linda was no longer invisible. A gate agent, not Susanna, someone younger, someone whose eyes were red-rimmed, approached with a supervisor. Ms. Allen, the supervisor said gently, we're ready to board you now. You and Spark. I'm so deeply sorry for what happened. Linda nodded. She was too exhausted to respond. As they began to move toward the jet bridge, Spark walked beside her wheelchair, his head high, his gait steady and sure. He didn't look like a pet. He never had. Behind them, phones continued to buzz. The video was spreading, jumping from the teenager's account to Twitter, to TikTok, to Reddit, to news outlets hungry for stories that revealed something broken in the world. And the world was beginning to see, not just Linda's humiliation, not just Spark's response, but the truth underneath it all. How easily power humiliates the vulnerable. How trauma is inflicted in public spaces by people who believe they're just doing their jobs. How dignity can be stripped away with a pointed finger and a demand to deny your own existence. The terminal would be forgotten by tomorrow. New crowds would fill the same gates, rushing toward the same destinations. But the video wouldn't be forgotten. And neither would Linda. Linda sat in the cushioned chair near her gate. A different gate now, a different flight, hours later, and stared at the boarding pass trembling in her hand. Spark was curled in her lap, his breathing slow and even, finally at rest after the chaos. She stroked his ears absently, her fingers moving through the familiar pattern that calmed them both. But her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was 26 again, standing in her apartment kitchen, holding a coffee mug she didn't remember picking up. The neurologist's words were still echoing in her skull. Permanent neurological damage, autonomic dysfunction. Episodes may worsen over time. She'd set the mug down carefully, precisely, and watched her hand shake anyway. That was 5 years ago, before the wheelchair became necessary, before the world became a series of accessibility battles and exhausting explanations, before she learned that her body was no longer something she could trust. She remembered the first collapse. She'd been at work, standing at the copier when the disorientation hit like a wave. The fluorescent lights became too bright, too sharp. Her vision tunneled. Her legs went liquid beneath her. She woke up on the floor with her manager's terrified face hovering above her and paramedics checking her pulse. The second collapse happened at home, alone. She was grateful for that, at least, that no one had to see her lying on the bathroom tile for 40 minutes, conscious but unable to move, unable to call for help, trapped inside a body that had simply stopped responding. The third time was in a parking lot. A stranger found her slumped against her car and called 911, certain she was overdosing. Linda couldn't speak to correct them, couldn't explain. She just had to wait, trapped and terrified, until her nervous system rebooted enough for her to whisper, "Not drugs. Medical condition." That's when she'd started researching service dogs. She'd been skeptical at first. Dogs seemed like a comfort measure, not a medical intervention. But the neurologist had been the one to suggest it, handing her a pamphlet for a nonprofit that trained alert dogs for autonomic disorders. "They can detect episodes before they happen," he'd said. "Give you time to get somewhere safe. Apply counterpressure to prevent full collapse." Some patients say it changed their lives. Linda had nothing left to lose. The application process took 4 months. The training took another 6. And then, on a cold morning in March 2 years ago, a trainer had placed a small, serious-eyed dog in her lap and said, "This is Spark. He's been watching you for 20 minutes, and he already knows your baseline." Linda had looked down at the little tan and white dog, doubtful. "He's so small. Size doesn't matter for pressure work," the trainer had explained. "What matters is focus. And Spark doesn't miss anything." She'd been right. The first time Spark alerted, Linda hadn't even realized an episode was starting. She just felt his paw press insistently against her thigh, once, twice, 3 times, the signal they'd practiced. She'd sat down immediately, and 30 seconds later, the dizziness hit. But she was already seated, already safe. Spark climbed into position across her lap, his weight grounding her, his breathing slowing hers. She didn't collapse. For the first time in a year, she didn't collapse. Over the following months, Spark saved her in a grocery store, at a friend's house, in a doctor's waiting room, on a sidewalk outside a coffee shop. He learned her patterns, her triggers, her tells. He became her early warning system, her anchor, her safety net. He became the reason she could leave her house alone, the reason she could travel, the reason she could exist in the world without constant supervision. Linda's throat tightened as she looked down at him now, sleeping peacefully despite everything that had happened. She thought about Susanna's ultimatum. Say he's fake, or you don't board. If she'd said it, if she'd lied to make things easier, what would that have meant? It would have meant admitting that Spark was dispensable, that her safety was negotiable, that her independence was a privilege someone else could revoke with a pointed finger and a policy they didn't even bother to read correctly. It would have meant erasing 18 months of training, thousands of hours of work, and a bond that had quite literally kept her alive. It would have meant reducing Spark, her partner, her lifeline, to a pet, a fraud, a lie, and it would have meant teaching the world that people like her had to choose between their dignity and their survival. Linda's hands stilled in Spark's fur. She realized she was crying again, but differently this time, not from fear or humiliation, from the sheer weight of what she'd almost lost. Not just the flight, not just her safety, her right to be believed. She thought about all the people who had been forced to choose, who'd given in under pressure, who'd left their service animals behind because someone in authority decided they didn't look real enough, who'd been stranded, humiliated, or denied access because proving your disability to strangers was the price of existing in public. How many people had Susanna done this to before? How many had she done it to since? Spark stirred in her lap, lifting his head to look at her. His dark eyes were calm, steady, present. He pressed his nose gently against her wrist. Not an alert, just a reminder. I'm here. You're okay. We're okay. Linda managed a shaky breath. Yeah, she whispered. We are. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing pre-boarding for passengers requiring assistance. Linda straightened in her wheelchair. Spark stood, stretched, and moved into position beside her, his body aligned perfectly with her leg. They'd tried to take him from her, but they hadn't succeeded, and that was everything. The jet bridge stretched ahead like a corridor between worlds, one where she'd been forced to prove her existence, and another where perhaps she wouldn't have to. Linda's wheelchair rolled forward with a soft mechanical hum, guided by a different airline employee, a young man named Marcus who hadn't said much except, "Take your time, ma'am. No rush." His voice had been gentle, careful, as though he understood that kindness after cruelty required a delicate touch. Spark walked beside her, his leash slack, his gait steady and professional. His head was level, ears alert but not anxious. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he was. A working dog doing his job with quiet competence. Linda wasn't triumphant. There had been no applause when the supervisor finally cleared her to board, no dramatic music swelling in the background. A few passengers had murmured apologies as they passed. Uncomfortable, half-formed words that felt more like absolution for themselves than acknowledgement of what she'd endured. Most had simply looked away. She wasn't broken either. Though her hands still trembled slightly and her chest still carried the phantom weight of Susanna's accusations, Linda hadn't shattered. Spark had seen to that. He'd kept her tethered when everything else tried to pull her under. She was simply whole. Tired, raw, but whole. As they approached the aircraft door, Linda caught her reflection in the polished metal frame. A woman in a wheelchair, a small dog at her side, both of them still here despite everything that had tried to erase them. The flight attendant at the entrance smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Welcome aboard. You're in 12A, aisle seat. Let me know if you need anything."
No suspicion. No interrogación.
Just welcome. Linda nodded, not trusting her voice yet. Marcus helped position her wheelchair near her seat, and Linda transferred carefully, Spark waiting patiently until she was settled before hopping up into the space at her feet. He circled once, twice, then lay down with his head resting on her shoe. Contact maintained, vigilance never abandoned. She reached down and ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Good boy," she whispered. "We made it." Spark's tail thumped once against the floor. As the plane filled with passengers, Linda stared out the window at the terminal she was leaving behind. Somewhere in there, Susanna was probably filing reports, speaking with supervisors, constructing whatever narrative would protect her from consequence. Somewhere in there, people were already forgetting what they'd witnessed, the discomfort fading as they moved on to their own destinations. But Linda would remember. She'd remember the cold fluorescent lights, the pointed finger, the demand that she erase the truth to make someone else comfortable. She'd remember the moment her body began to fail and Spark caught her. She'd remember every face in that crowd, the ones who filmed, the ones who looked away, the ones who finally saw. The plane's engines rumbled to life, a low vibration that traveled through the cabin. Linda closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, on the weight of Spark against her feet, on the fact that she was here, still flying, still moving forward. Not because she'd been permitted, because she'd refused to lie. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, running through safety procedures Linda had heard 100 times. She let the words wash over her, familiar and grounding. When the plane lifted off the runway, Linda felt the shift in pressure, the moment when the ground fell away and the sky took over. Spark didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his weight, maintaining contact, a steady presence that said, "Wherever we go, I'm with you." Linda opened her eyes and looked down at him. This small, unassuming dog that someone with power had called fake. This creature whose legitimacy had been questioned because he didn't fit someone's narrow idea of what help should look like. She thought about all the others like her, the ones who'd been told their pain wasn't real, their needs weren't valid, their truth wasn't enough. The ones who'd been forced to prove their existence to gatekeepers who'd already decided not to believe them. The plane climbed higher, and the terminal grew smaller below. Somewhere down there, authority still believed it could decide whose truth mattered. But up here, 30,000 feet above the judgment and the stares and the pointed fingers, Linda Allen knew something Susanna Gilman would never understand. The only thing that was ever fake was the authority that tried to silence the truth. And the truth? The truth walked beside her. Always had. Always would. Linda didn't win because she was loud. She didn't win because she had power. She won because she refused to erase herself, even when someone with authority demanded it. And Spark? He proved that some truths can't be denied, no matter how hard someone tries to silence them. Here's the thing. Stories like Linda's don't get told unless people like you make sure they're heard. So if this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you think, if it reminded you that dignity isn't something we should ever have to beg for, then I need you to do 3 things right now. First, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories the world tries to bury. Second, hit that bell icon so you never miss when we expose injustice like this. Third, share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Post it where it'll make people uncomfortable. Because comfort is what allows this to keep happening. Linda stood her ground when it mattered most. Now it's your turn. Subscribe, share, speak up. Let's make sure no one else has to prove their humanity to someone who's already decided not to see it.